Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horses Advocate podcast. This is Dr. Geoff Tucker, also known as Doc T, and I'm glad you're listening to me. I have tons of information that I want to get out that I keep reading or am exposed to, and I try to interpret for all the horse owners everywhere to understand their horses a little bit better, to help their horses thrive in a human world. The other day, I was listening to a podcast from the Equine Veterinary Journal that was interviewing Dr. Ben Sykes, a veterinarian in New Zealand who has an interest in sand colic. He's a surgeon there. And I was fascinated by this because there's so little things known about sand colic and nobody's studying it. And that's one of the things that he was suggesting, that there are no controlled studies on sand colic for horses. It can occur in any species of animal. And I'll never forget getting a phone call from my friend who was the veterinarian at the Miami Zoo. And she calls and says, "Geoff, what do you know about sand colic?" And I said, "Uh-oh, you're not calling about a horse, are you?" She says, "No, we just had an elephant die of sand colic. In an autopsy, they pulled out over 200 pounds of sand from his abdomen. That's a lot of sand, but not much for an elephant, I guess." So I immediately took an interest in this, and I'm going to pass on the information that I gleaned from it so you can apply to what you know about your horses. First of all, if you live in a clay environment where there is no sand, the chance of your horse ever having a sand colic is pretty low. I lived in upstate New York for the longest period of time, and I didn't even consider sand colic. It's one of those colics that you just don't think about until I had a Belgian one day go to surgery, and they discovered that it was a sand colic, and it was a complete obstruction of that horse. And I'm like, I thought sand was at a beach. And in my ensuing years of living and opening up my mind, I realized that all of Long Island is a beach. It's all nothing but sand there. Sand is along every coastline that we have, where we have horses, and a lot of horses live near coastlines. Here in Florida is one big sand pit. That's all we have, with sinkholes. So we have to be very aware of sand. And maybe where you live in your part of the world, you'll find sand. It's universal. It's everywhere. So if you don't have sand, that's great. We can end this discussion and move on, but you should stay tuned, because I'm going to talk about something very interesting that is going to help. All right. So the first question is, why do they eat sand? And some people have a theory that it's called geophagia. Phasia, however you want to pronounce it, is the eating of, and geo is the earth. And there's some evidence that they are iron and copper deficient. So I put that out on the table for you to hear. I think you should move it way off to the side. I don't think that's really the reason why. I know down here in the subtropics, a lot of plants store their sugar in their roots. So when they go into their dormant phase, where they're trying to protect themselves from dehydration from a dry period, they'll still want their sugar available. And some of these horses will actually pull the grass up and suck the roots to get the sugar out. And you'll see tufts of grass scattered amongst the paddock. And you'll say, uh-oh, these horses are looking for sugar. Again, just to reiterate, there are no evidence-based studies. And if I haven't talked about it in the past, I'll briefly mention that there are two types of studies: evidence-based, which is actually CRT, which are called controlled or randomized trials, where there's a placebo, there's a blind or double blind, where the person taking the treatment doesn't know, and the person who's doing the data collection doesn't know. It's randomized, so it kind of stabilizes out all the variables. So there's none of those type of trials in sand colic. It's all mostly anecdotal, and this is why so much doesn't seem to work, and there's still a question about it. So let's keep going on here. When a horse eats sand, it does not necessarily end up colicking. And I think that was a pretty interesting point. You can have one horse in a barn full that they all have sand, yet one will colic. And I thought that was really interesting. And I want to go into that a lot as I move through this presentation. Pardon me. They think that some breeds are overrepresented. And I don't know why that is. I can't imagine. But I guess there are certain areas near beaches that have different horses. For instance, maybe the working quarter horse is out in a range where it has more grass, whereas a confined quarter horse in a small paddock in Florida might have a greater exposure, but that wouldn't really mean that the quarter horse is more likely to get it. They do have a voracious appetite, which means those horses that seem to be hungry all the time will continually increase more sand. And I can understand that as well. But here's the interesting part. If they eat sand, it's really not a problem. What the problem is when they accumulate the sand and they don't get rid of it. And this is really important because a lot of people depend on that fecal glove test, where they take a glove, a plastic glove, or just plastic baggie, and they put a ball or two of manure in there, and they add water, and they mix it all up and shake it up, and then they let it settle for a while. You can put a thumbtack through one corner of it and pin it up against the wall and wait. And when you come back, the sand is heavy and will settle to the bottom. And you'll say, oh my gosh, look at all the sand in here. Well, it turns out that that test is not accurate at all. And in fact, it isn't the issue. It's just showing you that they're ingesting sand. And if you take all 10 horses in your barn, or all 3, or whatever number you have, if you're seeing sand in there, there's good news. The horse is not only consuming sand, but it's getting rid of it. And that's important, because the horse that doesn't get rid of it won't have a positive sand sediment test, but will end up under the surgeon's knife for sand accumulation colic. And that to me was just an eye opener. It's one of those light bulb moments, like, nah, duh, you're just like, well, of course that makes sense. And I was grateful I heard this from somebody, because we all just get in our little notches in our brain stuck, so to speak, where we say, okay, there's a horse that's colicking. Let's see if it's a sand colic. We'll do that, and we'll say, oh my gosh, there's sand in there. Then it's probably not sand colic. And some of these sand colics can be mild. In fact, most of them are just poor performance. They just basically don't feel right. And they don't always have diarrhea, and they don't always have colic. They're just starting to accumulate sand. And I want you to hold on to that thought. This poor performance or poor work ethic, they're associating with a possible sand accumulation. For those of you who've listened to my podcast before, does this sound familiar? Is there something else out there that could be causing the same thing? And as far as I'm concerned, it's gut inflammation, period. And this is what they ended up telling us, that a lot of these horses have some sort of inflammation in the gut. And there have been anecdotal reports and maybe some quote unquote scientific studies that show that there's a decrease in sand colic for those horses that eat more fiber. And everyone's been saying, if you want to prevent sand colic, feed a lot of hay. And I've always believed that. I've said, well, that makes sense. Feed a lot of hay and keep the gut moving. Well, it could be that if your horse's gut is inflamed by eating grain and grain byproducts and other inflammatory ingredients, there is a chance that they're accumulating sand because the movement of the gut has been altered. We also have to include in that not just inflammatory ingredients, but you also have to include any stresses. Overcrowding is one. Not having any pasture at all, just dirt lots. having a hierarchical, I can't pronounce a herd dominance problem. How about that? Where the horse is at the lowest part of the pecking order. You might want to consider rearranging the horses so that horse doesn't seem so stressed. And I've always been saying this, and I'm going to say it again. People leave a light on 24/7 or leaving music on, especially scratchy, poor quality music, or in fact, any music, and not providing silence during part of the day can be stressful to some of these horses. So just consider all sources of stress, including the bad employee that you have who's behind your back beating your horses. So the subacute signs of sand colic are pretty nebulous. They can also be applied to horses with chronic gut inflammation, whereas the acute sign of sand colic is still a colic, and trying to diagnose it as a sand colic, the fecal glove test will probably be negative in these horses. And so doing a fecal glove test really isn't going to help for a horse that's colicking, but it may help the other to identify if any other horse in the barn may be accumulating sand. So if you have 10 horses and one's in surgery for colic, and you do the fecal glove test, sediment test, and you find that the remaining 9 horses, 7 of them have sand and 2 of them have very small accumulations of sand, they may be also predisposed. And add that to your observations that they have a poor work ethic, or they're girthy, you tighten the cinch or the girth and they start to flag their tail. They don't like to be brushed. All these other signs of chronic inflammation in the horse's gut. Look for that. Okay. Boy, I've covered so much. So how are we going to look at these things? If you're suspicious of sand colic, a lot of veterinarians will pull out their ultrasound machine and look for it. And according to this podcast, according to this veterinarian, he said that ultrasounding can be challenging to be accurate. And I'd have to agree with him. Ultrasound can tell you a lot of things, but there's a lot of real estate down there in the belly. And when you get down to the area where sand usually accumulates, which is the lowest point of the abdomen, which is pretty much near where the girth is, the large bowel gets down there. You also have a lot of hair. You have to clip all the hair and get good contact. And it's a screening test, but if you don't see anything, then it's pretty highly unlikely. If you see something, you can become suspicious. But I think generally most people find that the ultrasound is a waste of time, especially if the horse is colicking. You need to move forward. The ultrasound is not going to help at all. What does seem to work very clearly, and this can be done in the field, is radiographs. And the machines of the past couldn't penetrate the abdomen, but we've got some really good high generating output machines and sensitive sensors that can do laterals of the abdomen, and even a blind man can see sandy accumulation in the gut. It's just this homogeneous white mass that shouldn't be there. It's not white because it's sand. It's just the sand blocks X-rays from coming through and exposing the sensor. So it's going to look white. So it's not really perfect. It really doesn't say much, but if you see it, it's there. And if it's there, they're accumulating. And if you want to go through your barn and take radiographs of all your horses, that's a lot of money. But if you're really concerned about it, it may be a good screening test, maybe better than fecal glove sediment test. Doing blood work is not going to help, and a bilitap is not useful either. So his thoughts were the X-ray is the best way. And let's talk about psyllium, which is a fiber, a husk, and it causes a mucus formation that's supposed to draw out the sand. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that actually works. And in fact, compared to a placebo where nothing's given, or something else, like any sort of brand, you have the same results. So it really is not effective just giving psyllium. However, if you add psyllium to magnesium sulfate, that for some reason is very powerful in removing sand. He said that it is so important that if you do decide to use mag sulfate and psyllium, that you must ensure that the GI tract is moving. The reason for this is the sand that comes out, he says, they poop a beach. I love that. I put it in quotes, they poop a beach. Because once you give this psyllium and mag sulfate, the sand is going to come pouring out. And if you've got a blockage in that intestines at all, you're going to create extreme pain and a colic, surgical colic situation, which is going to be very hard to work with because the bowel is compressing and trying to move the sand out. So you have to make sure that the horse is pooping out on a regular basis. There's no obstructions on a rectal exam. And it takes some experience to figure that out. So any of you guys out there listening to this, if you say, oh, wow, I think my horse has sand, I'm going to give it some psyllium and magnesium sulfate together, you better think twice, because you could kill your horse doing this. It's according to the author, Dr. Sykes, he said that it's 75% effective within 4 days. So this is a long-term treatment. It's not one and done. And they don't even know why it works. I think you'd be much better off making sure that your horse gets plenty of magnesium through a magnesium salt source, and be patient and try to prevent it that way. If you want the dose, I'm kind of afraid to give you the dose if you're not a veterinarian, and it has to go in by a nasogastric tube, and I don't want you to do that. So if you're a vet, just, well, don't email me. Just listen to the podcast, because podcast is there for everybody, but good golly, I'm having a moment here, whether I should give the dose or not. And it's basically a gram. I'm going to give it a gram per kilogram, a gram of psyllium and a gram of magnesium sulfate per kilogram in a nasogastric tube. And don't give any hay 4 to 6 hours prior to decrease the bulk. So you want them to have an empty stomach and empty small intestine. And you may want to give some Banamine beforehand. And you can do a fecal glove test to monitor as this treatment goes on. And you'll just see, you probably won't even need it, because they're pooping a beach. So I went ahead and gave you the dose. And hopefully you guys are smart enough not to go out and do it yourself, because I don't want you to kill your horse. So there's no effective prevention, according to Dr. Sykes. Decrease exposure, change social hierarchy, maybe add iron and copper if it's geophagia, but I doubt it. And he said, add roughage and keep the roughage off the ground. So hang the hay in a hay net. Don't let them be eaten close to the ground. And what he found interesting was if a horse colics with sand, it can recur in 3 weeks, which makes sense to me. They're continually ingesting it. So I think the bottom line take-home message is, if you're worried about sand colic, then get your horse's gut health in order. Do whatever it takes to decrease chronic inflammation. Understand the 2-week no grain challenge is not a gimmick. It's not a game. It's actually probably the best thing you can do for your horse. It costs you absolutely nothing to do. There's no supplement you have to buy. You don't need a vet's recommendation. You just stop feeding grain and stop feeding grain byproducts, and make sure that the supplements that you are feeding don't have any inflammatory ingredients in them. But most of them do. Things like wheat middlings, rice hulls, soybean hulls, rice bran, just all these things that are in there. And the additives of probiotics and prebiotics that may or may not be useful. The lignin sulfonate, which is my favorite nondescript additive to some of these balancers and hay extenders, that just cracks me up. I mean, why would you want to throw something in your horse whose primary use is for dust control on dirt roads? Don't ask. I don't even know. But anyway, get the gut motility correct, and that should help your horses in a sandy environment prevent that sandy accumulation. So I hope I've touched on everything. This podcast is relatively short, and that's good, because sometimes I bloviate. I talk a lot. And I'm listening to a bunch of AAP conferences that I'm getting my continuing education on. And there's a lot to go over. So I'm going to have some more podcasts coming out on those subjects.
Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There are two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.